He didn't see her limp. That was the first mistake Dr. Marcus Caldwell made as Elena Martinez passed his office at 11:48 p.m., her scrubs still crisp from the hospital laundry, her badge clipped to a lanyard that had been washed 1,000 times. He saw a night nurse shuffling toward the neuro ward like every other tired employee grinding through a 12-hour shift. What he didn't see was the way her left leg compensated on the turn, how her weight redistributed with the precision of someone who'd learned to walk again in a military medical facility. He certainly didn't see the trembling in her left hand as she steadied herself against the corridor railing, or understand that the tremor wasn't fear. It was shrapnel. Tiny pieces of Kandahar embedded near her radial nerve, legacy of the same IED that had turned Major Derek Cross into a breathing statue 3 years ago. Elena had specifically requested the night shift. The 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. rotation meant skeleton staffing, minimal supervision, and most importantly, patients who couldn't ask questions. She'd worked at Oak Creek Memorial for exactly 6 months, long enough to become invisible, short enough that nobody had dug into her employment file with real curiosity. The background check had skimmed past her discharge paperwork, past the pension that arrived monthly, past the fact that her last address before Houston was Fort Bragg. Night shifts were for people trying to disappear, and Elena had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being someone that nobody looked at twice. The neuro ward smelled like antiseptic and something else, something that leaked from the walls of rooms where time had stopped moving. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. Monitor cables hung like medical serpents. The fluorescent lights hummed a frequency that made her teeth ache, the same frequency as the ones in forward operating base Shank, though she didn't think about that anymore. Or tried not to. The differences between then and now had a way of collapsing at 2 a.m. She clipped her badge at the charge nurse station. Sandy Okonkwo looked up from her computer, glasses sliding down her nose, and nodded in that vague way that passed for acknowledgement between night shift staff. They weren't friends. They weren't enemies. They were people rotating through the same hospital like planets in separate orbits, occasionally crossing paths but never colliding. You're with Cross tonight. Room for 12. The usual vitals, neuro checks every 2 hours, feeding tube at midnight, Sandy said, her voice the flat effect of someone midway through her 7th shift in 9 days. Elena nodded. Any changes? No changes. 3 years of no changes. Sandy returned to her computer screen. Some patients we get tired of looking at because they get better. Cross we're tired of looking at because he won't. Elena didn't respond. She'd learned that silence was a more powerful tool than agreement. She picked up the patient chart. Derek Cross, Major, U.S. Army Special Forces, admitted August 14, 2021, after blast injury in Kandahar province. The medical summary read like a eulogy for someone still breathing: traumatic brain injury, Glasgow Coma Scale 5, neurological prognosis guarded to poor, no evidence of responsiveness to external stimuli in 36 months of observation. 3 years and 1 month, to be exact. Elena had counted the days. The hallway to room for 12 felt longer at night. The only sound was the squeak of her shoes on freshly waxed tile and the distant hum of machines keeping people alive who had stopped participating in their own survival. She'd walked this hallway exactly 94 times before. Tonight would be 95. She kept count. Soldiers kept count. Room for 12 was dark except for the pale blue glow of monitors. Derek Cross lay in the bed like something the ocean had spit out, his body there, his mind somewhere else entirely. The ventilator breathed for him. The feeding tube delivered nutrition his body had stopped requesting. His left arm lay on top of the blanket, and even in the dim light Elena could see the muscle atrophy, the way his fingers had curled slightly inward as tendons tightened without opposing force. He was a man being slowly dissolved by time, 1 hour at a time. She set down her supplies and approached the bedside. This was the moment every nurse performed dozens of times a shift, the routine assessment that became invisible with repetition. But Elena had never been good at invisible. She had been trained for precision. She had been trained to see details that mattered. She had been trained to save lives when the world was ending. His chart said non-responsive. But as she leaned closer, checking the position of his feeding tube, noticing the slight redness around the placement site that suggested early inflammation, observing the way his right pupil was marginally larger than his left, a finding so subtle it would require 3 separate examinations to confirm. She understood something that no one else had documented in 3 years. Derek Cross was changing. Slowly. Infinitesimally. But changing. His vital signs told a story if you knew how to read it. Blood pressure 118/72. Heart rate 64. Respiratory rate 16. All stable. Normal for a man lying in bed, normal for someone in a prolonged vegetative state. But the variation was something else. Most comatose patients developed autonomic dysreflexia, wild swings in heart rate and blood pressure triggered by bladder distension, pain, or simple neurological chaos. Cross's numbers were too consistent. Too controlled. As if some part of his brain was still working, still regulating, still fighting. She noticed his hair had been cut recently. Someone was maintaining him. Someone cared enough to keep his nails trimmed and his bed linens changed and his face shaved. That someone was probably his mother, she thought. The kind of love that shows up and does the small invisible work of preserving dignity for someone who can't reciprocate. Elena understood that kind of love. She had been trained in it. She reached for the dog tag around her neck beneath her scrubs, a habit so automatic she didn't realize she was doing it until her fingers brushed cold metal. The chain was broken, held together by a knot she'd tied 3 years ago when the order came down to return equipment. She couldn't return the dog tag. Some things you didn't return because they weren't yours to give back. The chain caught the fluorescent light as she bent over Cross's bedside, and for just a moment the metal flashed silver, a single point of brightness in the dark room. She released it and let it fall back beneath her scrubs. The weight settled against her chest like it always did. Like a second heartbeat. Like evidence. Elena began the neuroassessment with her left hand, the trembling one, and watched as her fingers moved into the familiar pattern, checking pupil response with her penlight, noting the slight dilation lag in the right eye, assessing muscle tone by running her palm across his forearm and feeling the resistance of contracted muscle being forced to relax. The tremor disappeared when her brain engaged the practice sequences. Muscle memory was its own kind of intelligence, the kind that lived in tissue and bone rather than thought. She'd learned that in a military hospital in Kabul, where the choice was between trembling hands and no hands at all. The monitors beat their steady rhythm. Outside the window, Houston stretched into darkness, the city lights creating a false horizon, the kind of view that made you forget how far you actually were from anything that mattered. And that's when she heard the footsteps in the hallway, deliberate, unhurried, the kind of stride that belonged to someone used to taking up space in a room. Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway like darkness recognizing darkness, his white coat immaculate at midnight, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who had never met a room he couldn't dominate. He didn't turn on the light. He just stood there, watching her lean over the patient's chart, her hand trembling slightly as she documented her findings, and something in his face shifted. It was the look of a predator recognizing a challenger it hadn't expected to find. Dr. Caldwell entered Major Cross's room at 6:36 a.m., his cologne arriving 3 steps before he did, expensive, artificial, the smell of a man who needed to announce himself before speaking. Elena was explaining the new stimulation protocol to the patient's elderly parents, her voice steady and low, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Mrs. Cross sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed, her weathered fingers interlaced so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her husband stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, both of them listening to Elena as if she were delivering scripture. The somatosensory pathway activation typically requires varied stimulus intensity, Elena was saying, her eyes on the monitor readings rather than on the door. We've seen subtle neural response changes over the past 4 weeks. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that shows up on standard imaging. But he's there. She glanced at Major Cross's face. He's listening. The door closed behind Caldwell with a soft pneumatic hiss. Nurse Nightingale, he said, and the words landed like an insult wrapped in a smile. Perhaps you'd like to share your medical degree with us? Oh wait, you don't have one. The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mrs. Cross's hand jerked toward her husband's. Elena didn't move. She didn't blink. She set down her tablet on the bedside table with the deliberateness of someone placing a detonator in a safe. This nurse with ideas above her station thinks she knows better than 13 board-certified neurologists, Caldwell continued, his voice pitching higher with the satisfaction of a man performing for an audience. Tell me, where did you study neuroscience? Community college? Online? Did you get your degree from a cereal box? The parents made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite protest. The kind of noise people make when they don't know which social gravity to orbit. Elena turned to face him. Her jaw was a single line of controlled muscle. She took one measured breath, held it for exactly 4 seconds, then released it through her nose. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from sadness, but from the pressure of holding everything down. She wiped it away with her index finger without breaking eye contact. I studied under enemy fire, Dr. Caldwell, she said quietly. Her voice had the weight of something dropped from a great height. Where did you learn compassion? The color drained from Caldwell's face like someone had opened a valve. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. He turned on his heel and left without another word, but not before she caught the tremor in his hand as he gripped the door frame. Mrs. Cross exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for hours. That afternoon, a piece of white paper appeared on the unit bulletin board, the one by the nurse's station where no one could miss it. The lettering was precise, the margins perfect, the words arranged with the kind of meticulous cruelty only bureaucracy could achieve. Incident report, Elena Martinez, RN. Unauthorized treatment protocols. Violation of hospital policy for .7, c. Formal write-up issued. Signature, Dr. Marcus Caldwell, Chief of Neurology. The paper was pinned at eye level. Every staff member who came through the unit would see it. Every colleague. Every administrator. Every parent visiting a patient would see Elena's name underneath those words like she was something dangerous that needed to be labeled. The next day in the break room, Elena sat down with her lunch at 11:15 a.m. A container of rice and grilled chicken. Nothing that would make noise. She opened it quietly and picked up a fork. The conversation at the far table stopped mid-sentence. One nurse, Jennifer, who'd always smiled at her, suddenly remembered she'd left something in her locker. Another gathered his yogurt and moved to the corner table. Then another. And another. Chairs scraped across the linoleum floor like accusations being filed one by one. The sound was deliberate, loud enough to hear, impossible to pretend wasn't happening. Scrape. 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 The rubber feet catching against the tile, protesting, like even the furniture understood what was happening. Within 30 seconds, Elena sat alone under the fluorescent lights. The hum of the ballast vibrated above her, a constant electrical pressure against her skull. She ate slowly. The rice was still warm. She chewed each bite 20 times, the way she'd been taught in field medicine training, mechanical function when emotion becomes a liability. Her hand moved unconsciously to the base of her neck, where the dog tag rested on its broken chain beneath her scrubs. The metal was cool. Real. Evidence that there had been another version of her, one who made decisions in seconds that saved lives in minutes, who understood that pain was information and blood was data and that you kept moving because stopping meant people died. She finished her lunch. Rinsed her container. Left it in the rack to dry. 2 days later, she submitted another formal request to Caldwell's office. A proposal for unconventional therapy techniques based on combat trauma protocols, the kind of neurological stimulation that had been proven effective with returning servicemen who'd experienced severe traumatic brain injury. The science was there. The evidence was published in peer-reviewed journals. The methodology was sound. Caldwell called her into his office at 4:24 p.m., 30 minutes before her shift started. His desk was a showroom of accomplishment, framed diplomas from Yale and Johns Hopkins, photographs with hospital board members, a leather nameplate that had been polished until it gleamed. He slid her request back across the glass surface toward her. The paper bent slightly under the pressure of his gesture. "You're not a hero here," he said. His voice had the practiced smoothness of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. "You're a night nurse who needs to remember her place. This hospital has a hierarchy. There's a reason that hierarchy exists. The reason is competence. The reason is training. The reason is that people like you don't have the education to understand the complexity of what we do." His smirk was a masterpiece. Satisfied. Practiced. The expression of a man who had no idea that the person standing 3 feet away from him had performed emergency procedures in dust storms where you couldn't see your own hands. Elena met his eyes with a calm that seemed to radiate outward like cold. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gesture. She simply stood there and said quietly, "I wonder if you'll sleep well tonight knowing you chose your ego over a patient's life." Caldwell's face went scarlet. His hand jerked toward his phone, stopped, dropped to the desk. His mouth opened and closed like a fish that had been pulled from water. You can't." But Elena was already at the door. She didn't wait for him to finish. She didn't need to. She'd already said everything that mattered. What happened next didn't just change the dynamic between them. It escalated everything beyond words, beyond hospital politics, beyond the careful hierarchy that Caldwell had spent years constructing like a fortress around himself. 2 weeks passed. Elena worked her night shifts in the careful choreography of someone moving through a hostile environment. She documented every vital change. She noted every subtle fluctuation in Major Cross's neural responses. She charted everything with the precision of someone who knew her work would eventually be reviewed, analyzed, scrutinized by people who didn't understand what they were looking at. Major Cross's condition wasn't improving dramatically. But it wasn't declining either. The flat line had become a story with subtlety. A narrative written in millimeters of change that only someone paying attention would ever notice. Then came the night of August 15th at 11:24 p.m., when everything Elena had been building toward exploded into crisis. Dr. Caldwell's office smelled like leather and expensive cologne when Elena pushed the request form across his mahogany desk at 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. The fluorescent lights overhead cast sharp shadows across his face, and he didn't even glance at the paper before sliding it back toward her. "Denied," he said, not looking up from his computer screen. "Your protocols are experimental. Unproven. We follow evidence-based medicine here, not hunches." Elena's jaw tightened for exactly one breath. Then nothing. No argument. No trembling. She picked up the form and walked out without a word, the way a soldier walks away from shrapnel. But that wasn't the worst part. By Thursday morning, the nurses who'd begun nodding to her in the break room had been systematically reassigned. Martinez had been pulled to the pediatric ward. Gonzalez, who'd actually smiled at Elena yesterday, was transferred to urgent care at the satellite clinic 3 miles away. Chen, who'd brought her coffee once, got shifted to the graveyard shift at a different facility entirely. Caldwell hadn't fired them. He'd scattered them like a hunter dispersing a pack, and the message was crystalline: proximity to Elena Martinez meant professional consequences. Elena noticed. She didn't react. She clocked in at 11 p.m. and made her rounds with the same precise efficiency she'd perfected over 13 years in the Army Medical Corps, back when every movement had to be clean and every decision had to save lives. The dog tag under her scrubs, the one hanging from that broken chain, the one she never explained, pressed against her collarbone like a weight she'd learned to carry without flinching. The real sabotage came in the form of a schedule change posted on the unit board at 3 a.m. Elena's shifts were restructured. Effective immediately. No more nights assigned to Major Cross's room. No more continuity of care. Instead, she'd work days in the general med-surg ward, far from the ICU, far from her patient, far from the subtle neurological signals that only she'd been trained to recognize. The new assignment kept her on the opposite end of the hospital during the exact hours when Cross's EEG patterns showed the most activity, the REM sleep cycles, the finger twitches, the microsecond pupil responses that indicated consciousness trying to claw its way back to the surface. 3 nights. That's how long it took Caldwell to make sure she couldn't touch him. Elena printed a copy of her new schedule and clipped it to her locker without comment. But her hands, those steady hands that had stitched a SEAL Team 6 operator's femoral artery back together in a combat helicopter over Kandahar, moved with a precision that had nothing to do with steadiness and everything to do with the particular stillness that comes before a storm. On Monday, she submitted a formal request for ICU access. The response came via email at 4:27 p.m. ICU staffing needs to be managed by department leadership. Further requests must go through Dr. Caldwell. Hospital administration. She'd filed the request with administration 3 days ago. The response had come back through Caldwell's office. He was circling the gate, controlling who got in and who stayed out. That Tuesday, Elena overheard him in the hallway outside the physician's lounge. His voice carried the particular tone of a man constructing a narrative for an audience. "The woman's credentials are inconsistent," he said to Dr. Morrison, the pulmonologist. "Military service, nursing license, but the timeline doesn't quite line up. I've asked the state board to do a deep background audit. These things usually indicate something." His smile, visible through the lounge glass door, was the smile of a man watching dominoes fall exactly as planned. The state board. He'd called the state board. Elena kept walking. Her shift was ending. Her locker was 3 corridors away. Her hands were already unlacing her work boots, black Salomon tactical boots with steel shanks, the kind that could walk 14 miles through Kandahar terrain without complaint, and she was already thinking about the apartment on Brazos Street and the microwaved pasta and the way her 17-year-old son Miguel always left his textbooks open on the kitchen table like he was trying to learn biology through osmosis while he played video games. But the dog tag shifted beneath her scrubs, and she felt its weight differently now. Not like an anchor anymore. Like something sharper. The investigation file grew thicker by the day. Caldwell had connections that ran deep into the state's medical licensing board, connections that hummed with the particular power of a man who'd spent 23 years climbing the hierarchical ladder by knowing exactly which rung everyone stood on and exactly how much pressure it took to make them fall. He'd requested her original discharge papers from the Army. He'd asked for her nursing school transcripts from 2008. He'd submitted a formal inquiry about discrepancies in her employment history that neither existed nor mattered but had the exact texture of institutional concern. The hospital's compliance officer, a nervous man named Hendricks who always looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days, had been assigned to review her file. Elena saw him in the hallway once, carrying a manila folder with her name on the tab, and his eyes wouldn't meet hers. That was the worst part. Not the sabotage. Not the schedule changes or the reassignments or the deleted access codes. It was watching people avoid eye contact. It was knowing they'd been told a story about who she was, and that story had been constructed by a man whose entire career depended on being the smartest person in every room. On Thursday night, Elena stood outside Major Cross's ICU room from 11:36 p.m. to 12:03 a.m., 16 minutes she wasn't scheduled for, hours she wasn't assigned to, time she shouldn't have been spending on a patient who'd been separated from her care. Through the observation window, she watched his monitor. Sinus rhythm at 58 BPM. Ventilator cycling at a steady 12 breaths per minute. But his eyes were moving beneath those closed lids in the distinctive pattern of REM sleep, the kind of movement that meant something deep in his unconscious brain was processing, categorizing, trying to wake up. He was in there. The consciousness was climbing. And she couldn't be there when he broke through. The intercom crackled somewhere down the corridor, calling a code to Trauma Bay 2, and the hallway briefly filled with the sound of rubber soles on linoleum and someone's sharp voice ordering units of O-negative. Elena turned away from the window. Regulation said she shouldn't even be here. Caldwell's memo said she'd face disciplinary action if she deviated from her assigned schedule one more time. She made it to the nurse's station before her phone buzzed. Text from Miguel, "Mom, you good? You haven't answered in like 8 hours." Elena typed back, "Fine, mijo. Long shift." I'll call tomorrow. Another lie. She was getting very good at those. Her locker was in the north wing. She had 7 minutes before the night shift supervisor would notice her on the wrong floor. She'd changed clothes, black jeans, the kind with deep pockets, a grey Army PT shirt from a unit she no longer belonged to, and she was halfway down the stairwell when she heard Caldwell's voice echoing from above, talking on his phone as he walked the same corridor she'd just left. "Yes, the investigation is proceeding well," he was saying. "And if what I suspect is true, we'll have grounds for immediate termination. These field nurses with ideas above their station, they always have something to hide. Something to run from." Elena stopped moving. The stairwell was empty. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. And then she kept walking, one step at a time, her breathing steady as a sniper waiting for a target to move into the sight line. The cardiac monitors erupted at 2:06 a.m. 3 alarms screaming simultaneously. Elena's head came up from the charts before her brain registered what the beeping meant. High-pitched electronic wails that cut through the midnight quiet like artillery finding its mark. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm underneath, steady, oblivious. Major Cross's chest rose and fell with machine precision while his heart was doing something very different on the screen above him. Ventricular fibrillation. The electrical system had simply stopped coordinating. A muscle quivering uselessly instead of pumping. Elena was moving before the resident arrived. She'd heard the overhead response tone crackling 2 minutes earlier and knew exactly where he was. She didn't run. Running meant panic. Running meant hesitation. She walked with the measured speed of someone who had done this before on a mountainside in Helmand Province while artillery walked closer. The attending physician was already in the room when she arrived, standing near the monitor like a man watching a stranger's ECG instead of one of his patients. Young. Competent by reputation. Completely frozen. That hesitation would cost 90 seconds. Possibly more. Elena didn't acknowledge him. She was already calculating vectors, thinking through the constraints of the equipment tethered to Cross's body, assessing the geometry of his chest under the hospital gown. "Move him forward," she said. Not a request. The resident blinked. "I'm going to need to call the crash cart." "Crash cart won't work. Move him to the left. Now." Something in her voice, something older than the scrubs, something that didn't ask for permission, made his hands move without his conscious mind catching up. He tilted the bed. Elena was already opening the trauma shears from her pocket, the one she'd carried since discharge, the metal cool and familiar as a handshake with her own history. The attending watched her cut away the monitoring leads with the efficiency of someone severing what wasn't working instead of hesitating over the protocols. O2 sat dropping. 78, 71. 64, the numbers fell like dominoes kicked off a table. Elena's hands moved on their own. Trauma scissors finding the 4 kit in her jacket pocket, she carried what no nurse was supposed to carry, had carried it for 18 months through shifts where no one asked questions about her jacket. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Sterile technique was a luxury she couldn't afford. She swabbed the left anterior chest wall at the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her fingers locating the ribs with the precision of reading Braille. The needle went in. Hiss of air escaping. Tension pneumothorax releasing like a pressure valve in a boiler about to explode. O2 climbing. 68, 75. 82. The attending physician's mouth had opened slightly. His hands hung at his sides like tools he'd forgotten how to use. But the needle was working, the immediate crisis was resolving. Elena's breathing remained level. Slow. This was information. Pain was data. Dying was just another problem with a mechanical solution. "Get me a 36 French chest tube," she said quietly. "And a 1.3 mm guide wire. Then call trauma surgery. Tell them we have a penetrating pneumothorax and we're going to need a thoracic consult in the next 40 minutes. The resident was already moving. Even the attending was reaching for the phone. No one questioned the woman who'd just done something in 90 seconds that most emergency physicians would have needed 5 minutes to conceptualize. The monitor settled into a sinus rhythm. Regular. Steady. The kind of rhythm that meant living. Major Derek Cross was still unconscious. But his heart was beating. His lungs were expanding without collapsing. Elena disposed of the needle with the deliberate care of someone removing evidence, washed her hands in the sink while the resident assembled equipment, and stepped back into the shadows of the room where the monitors cast everything in blue and green light. The attending was staring at her now. Really looking. Trying to reconcile the quiet night nurse in scrubs with the woman who'd just performed a field decompression using equipment that should have been in a military trauma bay, not in a hospital employee's pocket. Elena didn't meet his eyes. She was already thinking 3 hours ahead to what Caldwell would do when he found out. Word traveled fast in hospitals. Bad news traveled faster. By sunrise he would know that Elena had performed an unauthorized procedure. By breakfast he would have constructed a narrative around it. By noon she would be the unstable nurse who ignored chain of command. By evening she might not have a job. 3 days. That was how long the stalemate lasted. 3 days of Elena's restricted access actually meaning something now because the attending had submitted an incident report commending her clinical decision-making. 3 days of her scheduled 15-minute checks on Major Cross, with a resident now stationed outside the room to supervise, Caldwell's counter-move, subtle enough to look professional. 3 days of Cross showing the first genuine neurological improvements in 36 months. His eyes tracking light. His pupils responding without the 5-second delay that meant brainstem damage. Elena was reading his vitals on the 4th morning when his fingers moved. Not a reflex. A deliberate contraction of muscles that had atrophied from disuse. She saw it register on the monitor first, a spike in muscle electrical activity, before she saw his eyelids flutter. The movement was slow. Labored. Like lifting something impossibly heavy. But it was happening. His eyes opened. They weren't focused at first. Just the whites showing, then the irises rolling slightly as his brain tried to locate the world around him. Elena didn't move. Didn't call for help yet. This was his moment and she would not dilute it with protocols. His mouth worked silently. Trying to remember the mechanics of speech. Swallowing. All the small automatic functions that 3 years had stolen from him. Where his voice was the sound of something unused for a long time, a door hinge unused for a century. Barely audible. Like wind through a collapsed tunnel. Where am I? Oak Creek Memorial, Elena said quietly. Houston. You're safe. His eyes were tracking now. Finding her face. Recognition flickered across his expression like a candle lit in a dark room. He was looking at her neck. At the single dog tag hanging on its broken chain, the metal worn from months of her pressing it between her thumb and forefinger during night shifts. The tag had belonged to another major. Had hung around another neck in Kandahar. She never explained it. Never mentioned it. But Major Cross had been there. He had seen the man that tag had belonged to fall. His lips moved. She leaned close. His breath was hot and stale from the ventilator tube, the smell of a body that hadn't eaten food in 1,000 days. Major. His voice cracked. Dropped to barely a whisper. Major Martinez. Time did something strange. Stretched. Compressed. Elena's heart stopped and her mind went very quiet, and then she felt the precise moment reality shifted on its axis. He remembered her. Not as a nurse. Not as a civilian. As who she actually was. She straightened. Her hand found the dog tag and tucked it beneath her scrubs without conscious thought. Major Cross's eyes had closed again, the effort of consciousness apparently too much for a body that had been dreaming for 36 months. His breathing deepened. Back into sleep. Back into the dark. But he had spoken her name. Elena turned around and Dr. Caldwell was standing in the doorway. He was holding papers. White envelope. The kind of papers that arrived when things ended. His expression was composed, but his eyes had the glitter of satisfaction in them, the look of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. He'd heard. Of course he'd heard. The attending had filed a report. People talked. Caldwell had sources everywhere, nurses who wanted his favor, residents who wanted letters of recommendation, administrators who owed him consultation fees for expert opinions on hospital liability. Convenient timing, Caldwell said. His voice was the opposite of Cross's, smooth, practiced, confident. The voice of a man who had never once doubted his own authority. But it doesn't matter now. Doesn't matter what happened in this room or what you think you accomplished. Elena said nothing. She was already calculating what he knew and what he suspected and what he could prove. The attending had commended her. That was on record. He could twist that. He claimed she'd acted without authorization, violated protocols, endangered a vulnerable patient. The background investigation he demanded into her military service was still pending. He would have found something. People like Caldwell always found something. He extended the papers. She didn't take them. He placed them on the bedside table instead, near the monitor, where they looked obscene next to the machines keeping Cross alive. Your background investigation revealed discrepancies in your employment history, Caldwell said. Nothing we can overlook. Security will escort you out within the hour. I'm recommending immediate termination without severance. You understand that your medical discharge from the Special Forces will make future employment in healthcare challenging. He was threatening her livelihood. Her credentials. Her carefully rebuilt life in the 8 months since she'd stopped being someone the Pentagon called and became someone Houston hospitals hired at night so no one would have to look at the scarred left leg or ask about the limp. Caldwell was systematically dismantling every piece of normal she'd constructed. Elena picked up the termination letter. Read it in the way military personnel read orders, for accuracy, for what could be exploited, for the specific wording that might matter later. Everything was there. Effective immediately. Investigation pending. Grounds for ineligibility for rehire. The kind of termination that poisoned references and closed doors. She took one measured breath and looked directly at Dr. Caldwell. He recognized me, Elena said quietly. That means your prognosis was wrong. Your 36-month timeline. Your assessment of permanent consciousness loss. Everything you documented for his family. She folded the termination letter along its original creases. He doesn't need your hospitals or your protocols anymore. Caldwell's smile was thin as a knife blade. No one will believe a fired nurse with a questionable past. A woman who broke into a patient's medical records and performed unauthorized procedures. He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. Security is on their way now. I'd suggest you don't make this difficult. Elena didn't argue. Didn't defend. Didn't explain. She simply walked to the bedside and looked at Major Cross one last time, at the man who had just given her the only acknowledgement she'd ever received for what she'd done. His chest rose and fell. His heart monitor showed sinus rhythm. He was alive and awake and remembered her rank. That would have to be enough. The rain started while Elena was still in the parking lot. Not a gentle Texas shower but the kind of downpour that came in autumn, sudden and aggressive, hammering the asphalt like applause that no one had asked for. She'd packed the cardboard box during her escort out. One of the security guards had let her take personal items from her locker, a small mercy that probably violated Caldwell's instructions. The box held a cracked coffee mug that had belonged to her late husband. A dying succulent in a plastic pot that she'd been trying to save for 4 months. A framed photograph of a man in Special Forces dress uniform, dark eyes looking directly at the camera with the kind of intensity that never faded from prints. His name had been James. He died the same day Cross had been wounded. The same IED. The same roadside in Kandahar that had changed everything. Elena stood at the bus stop shelter, cardboard box balanced on her left hip, her weaker side, the one that sometimes ached when the weather changed like this, the phantom pain of shrapnel that still lived in the tissue even after the surgeries. Water was blurring the ink on her last paycheck. The numbers swimming. The hospital logo turning into watercolor abstraction. She watched it happen with the emotional distance of someone who had already processed loss in worse forms. A bus passed without stopping. Wrong number. Elena didn't move. The rain was soaking through her jacket, but she'd been wet before. Would be wet again. This was temporary. This was the lowest point. This was the moment where people stopped and decided whether they were going to break or whether they were going to do what she'd done in Kandahar, lower their center of gravity, breathe steadily, and wait for the next opening to move. Her phone buzzed. Text from Miguel. Her 17-year-old. * Mom, where are you? Dad's medal of valor isn't in the storage box. * She'd hidden it. Had hidden all of it, the silver star, the bronze star with V device, the medical commendation, the purple hearts. Had hidden the existence of Major Elena Martinez in the same way she'd hidden the dog tag under her scrubs. The past was a weight she'd learned to carry silently. Elena didn't respond. She stood in the rain and let it take the ink on her paycheck and pool around the dying succulent and watched the water blur everything she'd rebuilt. The bus that stopped this time was hers. She got on. Paid in cash. Sat in the back where no one would see the tears that weren't actually tears but the kind of thing that happened when your entire life compressed into a cardboard box and took on water. The next morning would come very early. Miguel would find something in her closet. A closet where she'd hidden every piece of her military service because talking about those 13 years meant reliving them, and she'd spent so long not reliving them that they'd become abstract, theoretical, something that had happened to someone else. But on that rainy evening at the bus stop, Elena simply sat with the weight of what she'd lost and the small perfect memory of a man waking up and recognizing her rank before the world took that away too. Miguel Martinez hit the main entrance of Oak Creek Memorial at 7:43 in the morning, his backpack clinking like artillery shells with each stride across the polished floor. The sound turned heads. Nurses paused mid-stride. A security guard straightened, sensing something was coming. The boy's jaw was set, 17 years old, with his mother's dark eyes and the kind of determination that suggested he'd been rehearsing this moment for days. His running shoes squeaked against the tile as he navigated toward the administrative offices. The backpack clinked again. Metal on metal. Heavy. Important. The hospital administrator looked up from his desk as Miguel entered without knocking, his movements sharp, purposeful, nothing like the uncertain teenagers you usually saw in waiting rooms. No one asked questions when a kid walked that way. They just stepped aside. Miguel reached the desk and upended the backpack. The contents scattered across the surface like a thunderstorm condensed into 5 seconds. A medal of valor dropped first, its ribbon catching the fluorescent light. Then 2 purple hearts, one after the other, spinning as they landed. Coins followed. Challenge coins. A folded citation. Papers. All of it bearing the unmistakable weight of a life spent in service. The administrator's pen stopped moving. The administrative assistant froze mid-keystroke. The room went dead silent. My mom, Miguel said, his voice cracking exactly once before steadying, deserves better than this. He pointed at the scattered medals. She deserves to be known. A trembling nurse who'd been processing discharge paperwork set down her clipboard and stepped forward. Her hands shook as she picked up the service file, the one that had been buried in Elena's personnel record, the one Caldwell had tried to expunge from the hospital database. She read aloud, her voice gaining strength with each line, Major Elena Martinez. Special Forces Medical Corps. 13 years of active service. Honorable discharge after wound sustained in combat operations. The nurse's eyes glistened. Every person within earshot had stopped working. The elevator doors opened. A man in dress blue stepped out, not hospital staff, not security. The bearing was different. The way he moved made the air around him compress. Navy SEAL, 23 years visible in the set of his shoulders, his name tag reading Mitchell and underneath it, call sign Mercer. He'd been here checking on Cross, an old teammate. He'd heard the commotion. He'd seen the medals. Without being asked, he walked to the administrator's desk and continued reading from where the nurse had stopped, his voice carrying the precision of someone who'd commanded in life-or-death situations. Silver Star Favela in Kandahar province. Bronze Star with V device. 16 lives saved under direct fire during compound assault, Sanjin Valley. 2 Purple Hearts. Combat Medic Certification, Advanced Surgical Techniques, Field Thoracotomy Protocol Certified. He looked up. I served with people like Major Martinez. They're the reason half my unit came home breathing. The board investigator cleared his throat from the doorway where he'd been standing, waiting for the right moment. He'd been scheduled to release his preliminary audit findings anyway. Might as well do it now, with all the key players present. His voice was steady, clinical, the tone of someone who'd spent 30 years identifying financial crimes. The investigation reveals systematic billing fraud spanning for years. Dr. Caldwell performed unnecessary spinal procedures. We've documented 37 cases. Patients who didn't require surgery modified their imaging results to justify intervention. Each procedure billed to insurance at between $9,000 and $14,000. The hospital's insurance claims investigator has flagged $3 million in fraudulent billing. We're also reviewing falsified patient outcomes data and unnecessary extended stays designed to increase billable hours. The State Medical Board is launching a formal investigation. Criminal charges are being referred to the Harris County District Attorney's Office. Dr. Caldwell's medical license is suspended, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the hearing. The administrator's face had gone the color of institutional walls. The assistant had already picked up the phone. Security was probably being notified. The SEAL team leader, Mercer, watched the ripple effect spread through the hospital corridors with the expression of a man who'd seen corrupt systems collapse before. Major Martinez should be running this department, he said quietly. Not cleaning up after someone like him. 6 months later, the criminal case had ground through the courts like a tank through sand. Caldwell took a plea deal, guilty on counts of fraud and falsifying medical records, his medical license surrendered permanently, 5 years probation, restitution that exceeded $500,000. His attorney negotiated out the jail time. Barely. His wife filed for divorce and took their house in the settlement. His savings evaporated into legal fees and damage payouts. His expensive suits got donated to thrift stores because there was no money for dry cleaning. The man had built a life on institutional power, and institutional power, once compromised, moves fast to destroy you. Elena walked past a strip mall on Bellaria Boulevard on a Tuesday afternoon, heading to the hospital for the evening shift. She stopped. Behind a folding table under a vinyl banner reading low-cost auto insurance, Dr. Caldwell sat in a rumpled Oxford shirt with the collar slightly yellowed, his hair unwashed, his face carrying the hollow look of someone who'd spent months understanding that consequences were finally real. He was explaining deductible options to a customer who wasn't listening. His eyes met Elena's through the storefront window. For 3 seconds, they held. Not hatred in his gaze. Not even shame. Just hollow recognition, the stare of a man who destroyed himself so completely that the woman he'd tried to destroy had become irrelevant. Elena held his gaze with the expression of someone looking at a parking meter, then turned and continued walking without acknowledgement. She didn't slow. She didn't nod. She didn't look back. The dog tag beneath her scrubs pressed against her collarbone, her husband's, recovered from the same blast that had wounded her and Cross in Kandahar, and it felt lighter than it had in months. At Oak Creek Memorial, Major Cross sat upright in his bed for the first time in 3 years, his speech improving daily, his neurological recovery tracked in graphs that looked like climbing mountains. Elena entered his room for the afternoon session, rolling a portable physical therapy station. "Your son brought your medals," Cross said, his voice clearer than it had been a week before, words forming with increasing fluency. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" His eyes had that sharpness back, the one that had been missing since the explosion. Elena adjusted his full line with steady hands, muscle memory, the muscle memory of someone who'd done this thousands of times, in hospitals and in field conditions and in places where making one mistake meant someone died. "Because I'm not that person anymore," she said. I'm a nurse. That's enough. She checked his vitals, noting the improvement, blood pressure normalizing, heart rate steady, O2 saturation holding at 97% on room air. You saved my life twice, Cross said. Once in Kandahar. Once here. That's not nothing. Elena touched the dog tag beneath her scrubs, the one on the broken chain that had never been repaired because the break itself was the story. You know what my husband used to say? Her voice was quiet, not sad, just remembering. True class is what you do when the lights go out. She met his eyes. Caldwell spent his entire career performing for an audience. When the lights finally went out, there was nothing underneath. No character. No dignity. Just a man in a rumpled shirt explaining insurance deductibles to people who didn't care. She pulled up his chart on the monitor, noting the improvement over the past weeks, motor response improving, speech clarity increasing, cognitive function returning at a rate that had surprised even the optimistic neurologists. Now let's see if we can get you walking by next month. Your team's been asking when they can take you back. Outside the window, Houston's evening traffic hummed with the sound of a city moving forward. A helicopter passed overhead, not military, a medical transport heading south toward Memorial Hermann, and Elena didn't flinch. She'd learned a long time ago that some sounds were just sound, and some were reminders. The difference was whether you let them define you. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever seen someone underestimated and then proven invaluable, if you know what it means to carry a weight no one can see, subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Comment below, would you have stayed and fought for your patient the way Major Martinez did, or would you have walked away? The best stories in the comments might be featured in our next video.